Okay. Good morning. Today is Tuesday, April 19th, 2022.
It's April 20.
Oh, I'm off by day. Sorry. Starting at the top of my list. Take two. Today is, good morning. Today's Wednesday, April 20th, 2022. It's 8:34 a.m. And this is a meeting, Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're taking up today H715, activating the clean heat standard, which we voted out last Friday. But we voted it out acknowledging that we needed to make some adjustments related to the process at the Public Utility Commission in order to enable them, in essence, to complete all the outreach and have a workable schedule. So we're looking at an amendment that we would bring to the floor. Also, I presented the bill in approach yesterday, and they said, we're not going to vote this out till we see your amendment, so we see exactly what's going on at the PUC. They are, and they had a keen interest in a lot of things in the bill. So therefore, I met with council. They also had a couple point edits they wanted to suggest. So all these edits have been distilled into one amendment. And if Ms. Schakowsky, if you could walk the committee through the proposed amendment to 715, please.
Good morning, Ellen Schakowsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. I believe the amendment has been posted on your website today. It's an amendment being offered by Senator Bray. There's 3 instances of amendment. So the first instance of amendment is adding a new definition. This is something that was raised.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, go ahead.
So my hope is that we'll change it so it's offered by everyone in the committee, but for drafting purposes, and have somebody.
Right, this committee does not have possession of the bill. It's currently in Senate Appropriations. But as was just mentioned, some of these changes came out of the discussion that happened in Senate Appropriations yesterday. So the first instance of amendment is adding a definition of energy burden.
Do you happen to have hard copies?
Oh,
Just post it.
I'll just
That's
post
okay.
it. I'll screen share in a moment. If you,
Okay.
Would that help?
Sure, but you can, they're not that complicated. So if you can walk
Sure.
us through, and then we'll get to look at them as well. Thank you.
Sorry, I
Yes.
just caught it down.
Yes, so first there's a definition of energy burden that's being added. Energy burden is used in the intent section at the end where the PUC is supposed to look at those with the highest energy burden.
Where'd the
First instance of amendment. So energy burden means the annual spending on thermal energy as a percentage of household income. I think your committee did briefly discuss this. This is a fairly common definition for this phrase. But Senate Appropriations is unfamiliar with this concept, so this was potentially helpful language for them, I think. So the second instance of amendment amends the public engagement process in the session law section 3. So it strikes all of subdivision C2, which is the section that currently in the bill requires the PUC to use deliberative polling. And so 3 changes have been made to this paragraph. And so the first is that it is changing the shall to a may. The second is that it's including methods beyond the deliberative polling. So I'll read it to you. In order to receive focused feedback from specific constituents, the commission, with the assistance of the consultant, may also hold at least 4 public meetings using deliberative polling or another method of receiving focused feedback from specific constituents.
Mm-hmm.
The facilitator may shall assist the commission in developing a format for soliciting feedback at the meetings. And so that sentence has changed slightly because previously that sentence directed the facilitator to develop the format for deliberative polling. And then each of these meetings shall focus on seeking input from a specific group, including heat, fuel dealers, low income, moderate income, fixed income customers and advocates, and customers who use large amounts of heating fuel. So this is changing this paragraph to be more permissive and allowing the PUC some flexibility on using not just deliberative polling, but another method of feedback.
So the editorial comment I would offer is that the House, based on the assumption that they were going to go through using an order to promulgate to implement the program, orders don't have the same notice comment requirements that rulemaking does. So we have this more stringent rulemaking process in place, which ensures in and of itself, theoretically, complete and adequate public engagement. The House, having not counted on it, wrote in 12 meetings into the bill as we received it. And the PUC's crunch is that this is a lot of meetings to require. They're sort of doing double duty on public engagement, and that pushed the schedule out theoretically 8 months, which would cost us, because we're on a calendar year cycle for the program, a full year of implementation would have become January 1 of 26. That has consequences because of targets that we pegged to 2025 in Global Warming Solutions Act. It's also slowing us down at a time when we know we don't want to move any slower. And it also means it's a steeper ramp to 2030. So every increment that you have to reduce is increased appreciably. You go from 5 years to 4 years. So you have to bigger steps to get to the same place. So for all those reasons, we wanted to give the PUC more latitude in terms of designing the public outreach section. So theoretically, there could still be 12 meetings, but this gives them some flexibility and buys them time, in essence, that savings of time. So that's the rationale behind it.
And I would also add, this is the language, this language was the language requested by the PUC the last time you saw them. They had requested other changes, but this one paragraph, this paragraph reflects their changes on this one paragraph.
So we're trying to balance out competing interests. Thank you. Any questions on that one?
So they're trying to do it faster rather than slower.
Right. Covering the same ground, but can stop on that now.
And is this referring to the rulemaking or to the orders?
It's still rulemaking.
It's still,
Faster is better than slower.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
So the final instance of amendment is on the second page. And so this is amending the first part of the report, the checkback report section. Oh, and it's wrong, actually. Sorry. Okay, well, we might have to fix this. So there's a change in here that was requested yesterday. So on or before February 15, 2023, January 15, 2024, and January 15, 2025.
That goes away.
All the, yeah, we're gonna strike the last date if you'd like to. The commission shall submit a written report and be available to provide oral testimony to the House committees on energy and technology, natural resources, fish and wildlife, and finance and natural resources and energy, detailing the efforts undertaken to establish the clean heat standard. So the only change here is the phrase "be available to provide oral testimony." In the previous version, it said "hold hearings with," and there was concern raised yesterday in the Senate Appropriations Committee that was unclear in some way. So.
Right, and to at least one senator in the room, or more, it read that the PUC was going to hold hearings that we were obligated to attend, as opposed to we were having them in. So it's like,
This was Sears's issue?
yes.
Yeah, I remember he talked to me a little bit about it.
So it's a pretty straightforward switch.
Right.
It's like, it was never intended that they were calling us to anything. We were going to hear from them. So this
Okay.
makes it more
Okay.
clear.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
And yes, so the third date was included in contemplation of potentially extending, but if the rest of this draft does not extend the dates in any way, then that will need to be struck.
So any committee comments, questions for council on this third instance? So with acknowledging that it becomes February 15, 2023 and January 15, 2024 strike and January 15, 2025, the commission shall, that's the one change. Are people feeling ready to propose an amendment to the bill that we passed out?
So moved.
Okay, so then we, in terms of who would, I would like to see all of us, if you're willing, beyond the amendment, so basically
Sure.
the committee amendment. So we have all four of us on the amendment. I don't know if Senator Westman's going to begin.
Formally do this or?
No, I think I don't believe, well, there's two pieces to it. Since we're offering it, I don't think we would take a committee vote on our own amendment. In essence, it's an amended committee report.
I'd love to see him on it if he'd be willing.
Yes,
Separate.
yeah. I
Yeah,
don't know what it is.
that makes, because he could be fine with it,
Right.
even though he's not voting for it, but it also brings,
And often he participates in
yeah,
making changes that fix things. So let's hold that while you're making the other switch. I'll check in with Senator Westman. I'm not sure. I know he's got a lot going on at the moment. So I will thank you very much. I'll get back to you ASAP after checking in with Senator Westman. And we're right on schedule. Thanks so much for the timely turnaround.
thank you. Just right on my thing. Do I sound worse?
No, we can,
So marvelous.
if you want to keep it going.
Yeah, I feel better, yeah.
It's like your stage voice. It's a little husky.
Yeah, right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So we are one of those days where we definitely need the program in front of us because we're changing topics 3 times today. So we're turning
Speaking
now.
of which, at some point, I'm gonna go to agriculture, to defend the water bill.
Okay,
They'll send one.
okay, sure.
Oh, you're representing us on the 466.
Yeah,
Taking a personal flotation device.
I think I'm taking, a shield.
Okay.
Right, I suppose for anyone who's wondering what we're talking about, Bill H466, which is an act relating to water. I'll give you the formal name in case this is of interest. It is surface water withdrawals and interbasin transfers. We voted it out the floor. Thank you. Unanimously in committee. There were questions from the agricultural community about that water use. Therefore, we referred the bill over to the agriculture committee from the floor yesterday, and it will be back out, we are assured, no later than this Friday. We'll see what the committee offers for an amendment on it, if any. But so now we're to back to H606, an act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection. We did a bill introduction, preliminary testimony, and returning to Sen. So good morning, Ms. Oates. Thanks for joining us. You had some suggested language for the committee to consider related to 606. So we'd love to hear what's on your mind about the bill generally and any suggested improvements you have in mind.
Good morning, Chair Bray and members of the committee. Thanks for having me in today. For the record, Lauren Oates, Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. I have to first say I'm very impressed by the two of you that are maintaining glasses with a mask on. They always fog up, so bear with me as I try to read notes through a little bit of foggy eyes. As you mentioned, Chair Bray, last week I submitted some written testimony to this committee in support of H606, but also acknowledging that there is a current gap from my perspective in the lapse in language regarding water conservation and the need to incorporate some freshwater language into the bill. I'm happy to walk through that testimony verbally if that's helpful, or answer any questions from the committee based on what was submitted. But again, the primary focus was for water. So I'll just walk through a couple of key points I'd like to get on the verbal testimony.
Sure, let's do that. And let me just check with you.
It's on the website.
On the website, okay.
So,
Is-
go ahead.
One quick question. Can you pull it up on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so the language will get up on the screen,
Okay.
and let's go ahead with your testimony. Thank you.
Yeah. So President Biden's America the Beautiful executive order, more commonly referred to as 30 by 30, expressly acknowledges the need to conserve both 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. H606, which is effectively a planning bill requiring the development of a comprehensive conservation plan, which has garnered significant support in the House, only addresses currently terrestrial conservation. The Nature Conservancy, alongside a cohort of watershed, environmental, and conservation organizations, respectfully requests the inclusion of some minor tweaks to the bill by this committee to incorporate water language for water-based conservation. I submitted the recommended tweaks and those organizations that support them to the chair and Jude yesterday. It's up on the screen now. I have it in hard copy if helpful for anybody here. For context, a few important facts to consider, which illustrate the threat of our current freshwater systems and the need to do something about it, ideally via this bill. 1 in 3 freshwater species are threatened with extinction globally. Freshwater vertebrate populations have declined 84% globally in just over 50 years. That is twice the rate of decline that we see in both terrestrial and marine biodiversity. In Vermont, 75% of our assessed river miles are disconnected from their floodplains, which causes significant biodiversity as well as community resilience concerns. The Vermont climate assessment of late last year found that climate change further threatens water availability, quality, and flows in our state. And finally, that Vermont has seen a 21% increase in annual precipitation since 1990. Conservation and restoration of our rivers and floodplains is the single most important action we can take to reduce this growing vulnerability for Vermonters. Aquatic systems conservation is distinct from land conservation. Acknowledging this distinction and the importance of explicitly acknowledging freshwater conservation, Vermont has convened an aquatic 30 by 30 collaborative with representation from a whole litany of groups, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS, all 3 departments of the Agency of Natural Resources, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, stakeholders from the University of Vermont, and a whole host of conservation and local watershed groups in the state. They've been meeting regularly for over a year now, trying to have the very conversations that would be had in the conservation planning process outlined in H606. They've generated significant buy-in and can offer invaluable support for the conservation planning process. So they've done a lot of the heavy lifting already and would ideally be part of the stakeholder input and plan development process outlined in H606. Again, the changes that I'm recommending are fairly minor. Again, they're supported by the groups at the front end of that memo that is on the screen. They aim to address the need to explicitly address water conservation in alignment, again, with global and national initiatives, which do incorporate land and water conservation language. To close, generally, I believe conservation planning for both land and water is an essential step to address the pressures posed by climate change and biodiversity loss. Putting on my forest partnership hat at the very end of this, forest partnership includes the groups Vermont Land Trust, Trust for Public Land, Vermont Natural Resources Council, Audubon Vermont, the League of Conservation Voters, as well as TNC Vermont. Just to broadly again extol the virtues of conservation planning and support for H606.
Jamie Fidel from BNRC came in and testified on behalf of the Forest Partnership last week. So I'll just reiterate again, from our perspective, we hold that conservation is a key strategy for climate mitigation, adaptation, as well as community resilience, and acknowledges that the inclusion and support for this very strategy is outlined in the state's climate action plan from December of last year. As described in H606, the plan will inventory a suite of conservation approaches and identify the necessary policy and funding support to achieve the state's conservation goals, which will be very critical in outlining how we might even come to a 30% by 2030 goal. We are supportive of this planning effort and would support resource allocation as necessary for the ANR to steer this planning process. We're always open to working with stakeholders to advance conservation initiatives and keeping this bill viable should there be any requests for tweaking. So that's a quick, mostly water-based, but a conversation with the Forest Partnership as well. Happy to answer any questions that you might have on the recommended changes to incorporate water-based conservation.
Well, thank you. It surprises me that water wasn't part of it from the get-go, honestly. And a lot of species. I'm just wondering how it is that how it didn't get included from the beginning. Is it that you were operating sort of in two different programs, or they just didn't consult with you, or?
It's actually an issue on a global scale, is how we understand the differences between aquatic conservation and terrestrial conservation. Land being largely immobile and freshwater systems being very dynamic. It makes conservation, discussions around conservation between the two very separate. And what often ends up happening actually is that the global community will say, water is the most important resource on Earth. We have to protect it, of course. And we make blanket statements like that, that then results in a lack of actual action, which is why we feel the need to make sure that we're expressly calling out water-based conservation. It's why there's this aquatic 30 by 30 collaborative in the state of Vermont that's working on these very issues. Because again, conservation of land, the characteristics of that look very different from what freshwater conservation looks like, which is really about the attributes of the system itself.
Okay. Senator McCormick.
That's, I want to pull way up a 30,000 foot view of this and the land conservation part as well.
Okay.
Can you give me a before and after if this bill passes? What will be different? Because my understanding is that the conservation has been the law of the land since Theodore Roosevelt. This is all sorts of federal and state conservation principles and laws. What does this do that we're not already doing?
It acknowledges the fact that the state is actively losing forests at rates of over 14,000 acres per year. And so despite the fact that about 70% of them are or covered in trees, we need to acknowledge the fact that there are different conservation approaches out there, and there's a need to make sure that we're not only slowing the rate of loss, but also reversing that rate, especially in the face of climate change, where we have the need to protect critical habitat for corridor movement for habitat species.
Okay, let me interrupt you. That's forgive me, but
Yeah,
don't we already do that?
we're losing 14,000 acres of forest a year.
No, in terms of corridors, that's an issue in Act 250.
It is an issue in Act 250. It is a goal of the Vermont Conservation Design, which you'll see throughout H606 is identified as a guide for how we're going to do this planning. So making sure that we're acknowledging that there are these critical habitat connector areas within the state that require conservation as part of the planning process.
That is not already the law.
That is not already being implemented to its fullest extent. We're currently looking at if we're using USGS terms, the gap statuses 1 through 3, TNC and a couple of other conservation organizations identify that we have about 22 to 24% of our land conserved. So we're still ways off from a 30% conservation of our landscape, which in a changing climate is especially critical, not only again for climate adaptation and species movement, but also for community resilience, where our forests hold quite a bit of headwater storage for our #1 climate-based threat, which is flooding in our downstream communities.
I interrupted you, I'm sorry, if you want. Let's just say with water, what, again, the before and after, what does this do that we're not already doing?
We don't have any protections for water-based conservation language in statute currently. There's for conservation of our freshwater systems, which should largely be done at a watershed scale. So codifying that in a conservation plan, a comprehensive approach to how we might understand, characterize, and define water conservation is something that we would like to see incorporated into the bill.
The Agency of Natural Resources isn't doing that?
Isn't doing work.
What you just said, just identifying the problems with water conservation.
Well, so VCD is not conservation design, which is a tool that the agency uses and could be used and should be used as a tool to guide the conservation planning process here. Does have mostly terrestrial, but there is habitat connectivity for freshwater species in there as well. But making sure that we're actually putting that in statute in a 30 by 30 or 30% by 2030, excuse me, context is important.
Thank you.
It will help us understand where we should be directing not only policy initiatives, but especially conservation funding, which is part of the inventorying process that the plan will need to do.
That's everything done.
Are vertebrates just fish? Or
Freshwater vertebrates, it goes beyond just fish, but a lot of
to
fish.
include what else?
Um,
Salamanders,
freshwater, well, they would be amphibious, but yes,
but not mammals.
no, not mammals.
Okay. Thank you.
They would be amphibious and they would need both land and water conservation protections.
So just following up on Senator McCormick's question, so we'd be really through this, is it accurate to say we'd be gathering information that we're not gathering now that would help make future decisions?
It would be for water, at least, it would be,
For the water.
yeah, it would be more formally identifying the key characteristics and attributes for what we would consider to be a conserved freshwater system.
Okay.
And in doing that will help us then understand the resources, policies, fundings, et cetera, that would need to be driven to different watersheds to actually achieve a 30%, for example, conservation to meet those attributes.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will make sure everyone in the committee has a copy to review of the point edits you made. We're basically inserting the aquatic language into the existing bill and sort of building out more explicitly, expanding the framework and being explicit about aquatic species.
That's right. And the majority, I highlighted the changes that are recommended. It's truly the majority of the additions are just the addition of the word and water or and aquatic systems following references to land. But there is the addition of a finding that's specific to freshwater and biodiversity loss, which I thought was important to make sure that we're characterizing and understanding.
Right. I see. So freshwater vertebrate populations have declined by 84% globally since 1970, twice the rate of decline in biodiversity in terrestrial or marine biomes, with almost 1 in 3 freshwater species threatened with extinction. So I would say that's a pretty clear statement of a need.
It is.
Call to action.
Yeah.
Great. So any more committee questions or discussion with Ms. Oates? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to invite Mr. Hancock to join the committee again. Good morning. Good to see you.
Morning. Good to see you all, and I appreciate the invitation to come speak with you. It's always great to talk with you guys.
It's snowing where you are right now?
It is not snowing where I am. We peaked out at around 6 inches yesterday, and then it kind of turned to slop and slush. So we're on that kind of tilt-or-whirl of, is it spring, is it winter? As far as I'm concerned, it can stay up at J Peak for now, and it's fine if spring starts down here. So this happens every year, and we'll get to it.
So thanks for coming in to talk to us about the 30 by 30 program. We'd love to hear your thoughts on things.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for the record, my name is Charlie Hancock. I'm a consulting forester working across the northern tier of the state with a pretty diverse set of private non-industrial landowners and nonprofits. I also currently serve as the vice chairman of the Working Lands Enterprise Board, which is the private sector lead on that board. And with Lauren as another member who you just heard from, I also serve on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. And I mentioned that last one because, as Lauren pointed out, meeting the 30 by 30 objectives was something that was considered by the subcommittee and was advanced to the full council for eventual inclusion in the climate action plan. So I think we can look to there as another reason why we want to be thinking about this. And I think it is important, the ideas that we're considering in H606 are really big, and they are really important, and they are really present to the moment that we're in here. I think, as a state, and I can look at my own, geographic region up here as an example, we're seeing inflow of people. I'm always kind of a little bit hesitant to use the term climate refugee because that can mean very different things, but we are seeing people move here, and a lot of them are moving here for reasons associated with climate change. I've had 6 land transfers just in the past year with folks moving from California, Washington, Idaho. And when I ask, why are you coming here? They're coming here because of the fires, of the droughts, of all the things that we know are happening out west. And, when folks sell a 2-bedroom, ranch in Palo Alto and walk away with $3 million in their pocket, they can come to Vermont, and that money has a lot different buying power here. And so we're already seeing, and I think we're going to continue to see changes in our landscape as we see this influx of people and influx of development. Combined with this, we're also looking at a big expansion of broadband, which might not seem connected to this, but I think it is, because when in 2 years we're going to have high-speed fiber strung to the end of every Class 3 road here in Montgomery, which is great because I have consolidated communications, which I'm sure others do on the committee, and it leaves a lot to be desired. But once that high-speed internet is there, it's going to enable that other kind of development, that inflow. I've had a number of people move here in the past year and comment that they came here to work remotely, but they can't because of the lack of that infrastructure. And so as we build out these things, we're going to see an impact on the landscape and development. And as Lauren pointed out, we're already seeing close to 15,000 acres a year in forest land being converted to development. That doesn't account for conversions of ag land. My hat's pretty much in the forestry sector. But we're seeing that loss of these lands. And so I think, now we need to think about how to plan and respond to these impacts, while also thinking about how we can encourage the growth that we want. I'm the chairman of the select board here in Montgomery, and one of the continual, questions we wrestle with is how do we encourage that positive growth, in our village centers to meet our town plan objectives. So overall, I support the bill and the goals in H606. It's really just directing advancing the permanent conservation of working lands and natural areas and creating a framework for maintaining a resilient landscape, which is going to be employing a suite of diverse goals. And then, as Lauren mentioned, using the Agency of Natural Resources Vermont Conservation Design as a guide for this work. I think it's important to emphasize, as we consider conservation and the objectives here in the bill, that we want access to all the tools that will maintain protection of key properties. We often talk about big C or little c or the conservation continuum. Easements and permanent protections of these lands are one very, very, very important tool. But we have a number of other tools in our toolbox. Current use is a great example. The programs that help landowners execute conservation practices on their property, whether they're reserves like CREP or actual active management practices like we see with the NRCS and EQIP. And these are all part of that toolbox because conservation takes time. Easements are a part of my portfolio of work up here, and they take a lot of time. And so 2030 is going to get here pretty quick. And these other non-permanent conservation, tools that we've got, the little c, the conservation continuum, the conservation ladder, whatever you want to talk about it as, they're critical to ensuring that land base is there when we have the opportunity to get to it. So I think we need to consider all of this as part of our package as we look on this time frame, which again seems kind of long, but 2030 will be here before we know it. And so coming out of this, we want a plan that's aspirational. We want to shoot for the moon here, but I think we also want to be realistic, actionable, and achievable in what we do. And so the goal here is conservation planning with protection of these connected and ecologically resilient landscapes. And that 30% numeric target is just one part of that big puzzle. And I want to emphasize that in reaching that part of the puzzle and our overall goals here, we're really talking about engaging willing landowners to advance the pace of land conservation targets and to promote the sustainable management practices on those lands, which I think only together are what's going to support biodiversity and community and climate resilience. So, we're not seeing this work at the scale we need to now. And so when we think about this question of what will this bill do, what will this bill change if it's passed? I think the important thing is that it's going to elevate the conversation. We're not having this conversation yet at the scale and across all the partners that we need. It's happening. It's happening in different rooms with different people, with different organizations in the public sector and the private sector and the nonprofit sector. We have an opportunity here to really elevate this as a priority of the state, put ANR in the lead and draft a collective common plan about how we're going to move forward and meet these objectives. So again, overall, I think I support the bill. Most of my comments, I think, where my head goes is less around the bill itself and more in terms of crafting the plan that comes out of the bill. To that end, I think that there's some important considerations to be made around some of the conservation goals in the bill, as well as how we think about Vermont conservation design. And as it relates to these three categories of, reserve lands, conservation lands, management lands, however you want to define them, because the targets in Vermont conservation design are, they're aspirational goals to assist in planning, but they're really getting at kind of the idea of how much and where, whereas the categories of management we're talking about are just that. It's categories around management decisions. What do we do on these lands? So while they are deeply connected, they're not quite the same thing. So just wanted to point out that there's an important overlap between the different management regimes that we're talking about and the protection or perpetuation of ecological features and functions described in ECRD. As the bill points out, I think that, the targets that we're looking at can't just be met on state lands as far as the overall conservation objectives. It's going to include private lands. That's going to mean working with willing landowners. And again, going back to this idea that as we work with these landowners, it's that conservation continuum that we need to look at, with that permanent conservation being either one part or an end state or a final goal, but not to discount the rest of that continuum of tools that we've got in our toolbox. One of the things that I think I really want to highlight here is the funding. The bill does talk about funding and the need to address that in the plan. I serve as president of an organization called Cold Holiday Canada. It's about 10 years old. It was founded up here in 7 towns along the northern spine of the Greens, looking at forest. Oh, sorry. The organization is called Cold Holiday Canada. It's a regional nonprofit conservation partnership. Again, we founded it about 10 years ago. And our focus is really around conservation stewardship on these properties and the eventual protection of, our goal is doubling the amount of conserved forest land in our region by 2030. And over the last 10 years, we've worked with a whole myriad of landowners to kind of slowly move forward with this work. Again, conservation takes time, but what we're seeing is that we have the land base here. We've got landowners that are interested in conservation, in conserving their lands. And our big hurdle is funding. Conservation takes time, but it's also expensive when we think about the costs around acquisition, costs around stewardship capacity, just the nuts and bolts around legal fees, appraisals, all the things that go into this work. So we really need to think about how we're going to fund this. And that's not just public dollars, it's philanthropy, but that needs to be a big part of the conversation that we're going to have if we're going to really get to this end state that we want. And another thing just to highlight here, again, as the bill discussed it, it's going to take a partnership. ANR might be in the lead, but it's not just ANR doing this. So we really need to bring all of the organizations together that are working in this space to the table. I know that the bill talks about 3 public meetings, which I think is great, but I think there's a need for a very much deeper, broader engagement with all of these partners. We're talking about land trusts, conservation organizations. All these entities are going to be, full hands on deck to make this happen. That said, with ANR as the lead, I do think there is a question here around capacity. I think that ANR can do the work, but I do want to make sure that they are given the staffing and funding capacity to make this happen, because we all know kind of what happens with unfunded mandates to do things. It just creates more stress in the system. So I guess kind of in closing, I just want to kind of zoom out a little bit and just say that, I think we need to have this conversation around H606 kind of in a much broader conversation as we consider Vermont conservation design targets and the challenges around climate adaptation and resilience. I think it's not just a case of investing in conservation and the need to do the work that's outlined in this bill, but we need to reinvest in the land itself, not just its protection, but in its restoration. We need to invest in the working lands economy. The working lands economy has an intense and immense conservation factor in and of itself. So thinking about how we can really lift that up as a foundational element to our state and have it continue to be one of the main reasons why Vermont looks like it looks. And so we have to kind of ask ourselves, how does this plan in 606 serve or act in partnership with these broader viability goals, both around, ecological objectives, as well as, our thoughts around community and rural economic development. I think as the title of the act suggests, it's about communities as well. So I see this work really moving kind of in parallel with other work that we're seeing. The Forest Futures Plan, which is currently being discussed, all of these things kind of come in tandem. It's not one or the other. We really need to do all of this work together to get us to where we need to go as a state to meet these pretty heady, pretty weighty, pretty massive, but pretty important objectives. So that's it for my testimony on H606. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee has, though.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hancock? I have a couple. You just were alluding to it at the end. One of the things is permanent protection. And so there's been a little bit of pushback. People worrying about, well, permanent protection is sort of too high a bar to strive for, or could have other consequences, taking forest land out of production, for instance. So can you address that concern, especially because you are a literal boots on the ground working forester?
Good question.
So I think there's two elements to the question there. The first one that I want to address is just the idea of taking land out of production and permanent conservation. So I think if we think about permanent conservation in terms of conservation easements, kind of that permanence element, and not thinking about that three categories of management we're talking about. The bill talks about the reserve lands. I don't have the language in front of me, but reserve lands, light touch lands, and managed lands, right? So in terms of meeting the 30 by 30 targets and permanent conservation, we're talking about working lands. We're talking about lands that are actively managed, that are in production. We're also talking about lands that aren't, lands that are set aside as reserves. And sometimes those lands are on the same land base, right? Like one parcel might have areas that are not in production due to ecological values and functions, and other areas that are in production, and in production in different ways. It could be timber harvesting for certain objectives. It could be carbon sequestration. It could be sugaring. So I do think that it's important to talk about permanent conservation as being the whole suite of lands that we see out here. Now, in terms of kind of the tension between big C and little c conservation, so that permanent conservation using the tools like easements versus little c conservation, tools like UVA or other stewardship programs that assist landowners. Again, I think that it's important to consider that we need all of these tools in our toolbox. And while we might put a marker out to say, by 2030, we want to see 30% of the landscape permanently protected, I think we do need to acknowledge that conservation takes time. I mean, we've been working with some landowners for close to 10 years on easements, and we're just getting kind of to that point where we're putting pens to paper. It takes family conversations around kitchen tables with multiple people to kind of get to that place. And so I think there is a valid concern that we can be aspirational in terms of we want to see 30% permanently conserved, but we need to acknowledge that we might not get there, and that's okay, right? We can try, we can shoot for the moon, but we want to make sure that we have those other tools in our toolbox to allow for those lands to maintain viability as we work towards those objectives. And so I guess it's not yeah, it's not if or, it's yes and in terms of, permanent conservation and the other tools that fall under that little c conservation category.
So, well, and you pretty much answered my second question, which is, I've heard some concerns that little c conservation could be disrupted by this more big C permanent conservation. But my impression is from everything you've said that they're entirely complementary. And they're not competing, they complement each other. They're for different clients with different goals or something like that.
Yeah, no, I see little c and big C as incredibly complementary. And I see, little c happening on lands that are big C lands, right? So it's not like it's a diametric choice between one or the other. Now, granted, there will be individual management questions. This is kind of what gets into those 3 tiers of categories the bill lays out around lands that, perhaps the best option is to take a hands-off approach as opposed to other ones where we can practice more kind of intensive management. But they're not mutually exclusive by any means.
Okay. And depending on I've heard different numbers that Vermont might be currently at somewhere between 24 and 26% conserved. I'm not sure quite why it's that big a range, but it just seemed like a achievable goal. Aiming for I know it's aspirational, but does it seem achievable by 2030 that we might get to 30%?
Yeah, so I don't know the current number of the current percentage of conserved lands. And again, I have to define whether we're talking about big C or little c, because if you talk about little c and UVA, then I think we're probably maybe more than 30% if you add state and federal lands. But as far as kind of that big C target, I personally think it is doable. I think it is achievable. I think, again, it's going to take a question of capacity, especially around funding. It's going to take coordination between, both the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. But I think some of that is a task of this plan, is to figure out, is it achievable? And if so, how do we do it? How do we kind of set those markers out in front of us? And so I think one thing that this plan has the ability to kind of answer is, how do we meet that goal? So I can sit here and say, yeah, I think it's achievable. I'm optimistic. But I think that what we're talking about here is, essentially just creating that space to draft this plan to define that question, to answer that question, and how we would get there if we do.
And you're familiar with how as you've alluded to funding a number of times. So in the end, funding has a lot to say about what we get to do or not get done. Can you help the committee better understand, or remind me at least, how the money to these projects flows? Like, is this generally come out of, we have the property transfer tax that sends a large, it's not withstood regularly, but sends a significant chunk of money off to VHCB, and does that also then get reappropriated through land trust and others to support conservation measures? What's the principal funding mechanism beyond philanthropy?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's probably a really complicated web of connections. So how best to describe this? So yes, there is public dollars that come from the state. Your reference to VHCB is a really important one, and I'll just put a side plug in for fully funding VHCB to the statutory requirements that the legislature has. That's really important to do, and I would fully support that. Every opportunity we have. But yeah, VHCB has got money for conservation. They've recently updated some of their parameters around how they look at working lands versus sugar bushes. So there's a bucket of funding there. There's other buckets of funding through other nonprofit sources, thinking about the Vermont Land Trust, New England Forestry Foundation. There's a whole host of other entities. We can look to Northeast Wilderness Trust. So land trusts, they generate a fair amount of capacity for this work through private fundraising, through reaching out to other foundations for grants of resources. There's federal funding. Forest Legacy, has been an immense tool here in the state. Hats off to Senator Leahy for all the work that he did on that program and for his, ability to bring the funds back to the state for this work. So we've got federal money. We've got small entities like Cold Holiday Canada raising money for conservation. We're launching a pretty ambitious capital campaign to raise close to $500,000 this next 2 years to support this work. Other federal sources, we've got the RCPP program with the NRCS, which offers money for forest land conservation and other lands conservation. NRCS gets really complicated really fast, and they tend to change their rules almost once we figure out how they work and work well, NRCS will change their rules. So that's a different can of worms to deal with. But there's a big pot of money through the NRCS for forest land conservation and for ag land conservation too. So there's a whole host of state, federal, private funds available for this work, and it's going to take, all of those pieces to make it happen. Because even if we went to every landowner and said, hey, we're just looking for a donation of an easement, which is a little bit, potentially problematic in and of itself. I think ideally we'd love to compensate landowners for these easements that they are selling or donating to some degree. Especially when we look at the track record in the state of fully funding a lot of the agricultural easements. One of my biggest hangups with forest landowners is sometimes talking about how there's no money for forest land conservation when they can point down the road to a farm that was paid the full value for their easement. But even if we take away this idea of a sale or a bargain sale of an easement, you're looking at easy $10,000 to $30,000 just in associated, costs to get that easement across the finish line, to fund the stewardship endowment. And when you scale that up to kind of the acreage that we need to meet these goals, it's a lot of money. And so it's something that we're going to have to take really seriously in terms of, how do we do it? How do we look for it? How do we invest in it?
Well, thanks so much for your work in the field and work on different commissions, panels, et cetera, to help make this happen. And it's always great to have you in because you have a lot of good information to share on every visit. So any committee questions, further questions for Mr. Hancock? Okay, thanks again. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. And with that, we checked in with JFO, and there is a fiscal note on the project, on the bill. So, Mr. Dickerson, good morning. Thanks for joining us. You could walk us through the fiscal note of the bill, that will be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Good morning, senators. And as you requested, I did provide a fiscal note on H606. For the record, Dan Dickerson, JFO. Most of what I wrote revolves around the creation of this conservation plan, which would be the responsibility of the Agency of Natural Resources. I reached out to Secretary Moore, who informed me that their position is that they would want a limited service position to do the planning work, which would be writing the plan, doing the public outreach component, and working with other staff. And then they would also probably want a consultant who could do the inventory of existing conserved lands. So she gave me a ballpark of cost for those two components, and it adds up to, sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, no, sorry. Go ahead, please.
So their ballpark in fiscal year, state fiscal year 23 was probably about 125,000 to 150,000. I think what that actually ended up being would be dependent on how soon they could get a position, advertised, hired, in place, and able to do the work, which, at this point, given how many vacancies there are around the state that haven't been filled, it's possible, but it's a challenge to see that happening quickly, given that the bill also has an effective date of July 1st. And then it would also depend on, how much a consultant ended up being, if they needed one. It's possible that, staff could do some of that, or VCGI could do some of the inventory, but, I'm sure they're all pretty slammed as well. So anyways, And then in FY24, you know, it'd mostly just be paying for the position for about a half year, maybe longer, depending on whether the person was brought in during the I guess it would be the 2024 session to testify on the bill, provide information to legislators. So currently the bill does not have an appropriation. It does not contain authorization for a new position. So I think if you wanted to go that route, you'd have to propose that as an amendment from your committee on the House legislation. And the only other thing that I added to the fiscal note was just sort of the, you know, looking out a few years after the plan is out there. There could be, you know, pressures for new state funds to either buy land outright or you know, compensate landowners for easements or some other conservation mechanism. And so not to say that's a good or a bad thing, just to say that, you know, in the grand scheme of how many of all the different pressures there are on state government funding, this would be a potential new one. So just so you're aware. And that is it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's helpful to appreciate your thinking it through, not just for 1 year, but for that longer term perspective as well. So, any questions for Mr. Dickerson? Senator, what's going to be your honor, folks? Do you happen to know if 606 is sort of in that basket of things that if they move, they would? I know there were some sort of contingent bills hanging in the wings that got budgeted for. I don't believe this was one of them.
I haven't heard of this being on the list.
Okay.
The definitive list would be in joint fiscal, and Stephanie would have that list and is doing the tracking. So I think the question really is to Dan, have you checked with Stephanie to see if this is one of the bills that she's been keeping track of?
Off the top of my head, I don't think it is. I did see the list recently. I think the big piece within your committee is there's 35 million set aside for contingently for H518, but I don't think there's anything else. But I will double check and confirm that.
If you could do that and get back to us, that would be helpful.
Certainly.
All right. Thanks.
She has a tracking.
Right. Excellent. Okay. So, any other questions, comments for Mr. Dickerson? Great. Thanks so much for putting this together, and we'll wait to hear back from you whether or not it's on Stephanie's list. That will be good to know for sure. Okay.
Okay. Thank you all.
All right. So that was our last witness for 606. We're actually operating a little ahead of schedule. So why don't we take a 15-minute break and come back at, we're 45 minutes ahead. Just come back at 10, 15 minutes earlier than our current schedule. And then we can have a little bit of committee discussion time. I know that people also have other things they probably want to do.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, great.
And I have an 11 that'll probably go 20 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. So
Terrible time of year.
When you get back, I will need to leave.
Yeah.
okay.